Hello everyone and welcome back to the Forge. Now today we're going to be doing something a little bit different than our normal forging projects. Today we're going to be working on the first knife I ever made. Now I made this knife a little over a year ago, the very first real knife that I ever forged out. It was on a hand crank, it was on a coal forge with a hand crank blower. I didn't have a grinder at the time, so I used a flat file to do most of the beveling on it. And overall, it performs very poorly, which is one would expect. A lot of people may sit back and say, why would you want to take your very first knife and mess it up? You should use that as a piece to look back on and see how far you've come. Well, that is true. My very first knife-shaped object was a railroad spike knife. This is my very first somewhat real knife. And so I would rather use this knife in the kitchen or to do work with than just look at it and say, yeah, I've grown so much since the very first time I've ever tried to do this. So we're going to change the profile of this. The one thing I did get right on this was the heat treat. Everything else, as you can see, is kind of out of whack. The blade and the clip point areas, the proportions are all off. The handle's basically a big fat 2x4, and it's just not done very well. And so we're going to turn this into a functioning knife so I can use it in the kitchen, in the house, doing various things. And I wanted to bring y'all along for the ride. So the first thing we're going to start off doing is get these handle scales off of here so we can have a look at what we have to work with. So let's go ahead and get over to the bandsaw and cut these pins off. The epoxy's long gone in here because it wasn't prepped right. So let's get after it. Alright, let's get this rust cleaned off so we can figure out a plan of attack. Alright, and there we go for the most part. Now looking at this, I can already see that when I first assembled this knife, the tang was obviously not clean enough and the epoxy never actually stuck. This was only held on basically by the pins. Also, I can tell right now we're fixing to switch this over to a hidden tang, removing this point down here. This was made out of an antique lawnmower blade that we had laying around, which is usually one of the materials of choice for beginning knife makers. But I remember being so worried about not having enough material to make the handle. Now looking back at it, there was more than enough to forge out a tang, that I kept this end here, which is rolled and folded over where the end of the lawnmower blade was. So right out of the gate, we're going to remove this and make this a hidden tang. Now, also, you can see I've got a little cold shut formed right here. That'll need to be removed. And then, like I said, we've got to reprofile this whole blade. It's horrible. And there's hardly any bevel at all. I mean, you can see where it just rounds over. It looks like the plunge line goes way up towards the spine. And it don't. It may right up here by the ricasso area, and that's just because that's where I worked it the most when I started out. In fact, if you look here, you can still see some of the areas where I used the file on this. But we're going to reprofile this, make it look much nicer, give it a nice clean bevel line, and turn it into something that can be used instead of something that just kind of sits there. So I'm going to start out with getting a paper template. Like I said, we're not going to reforge this because it is a good hard blade. We'll just keep it cool and we'll just stock remove all the profile I want and then go back and clean everything up. And like I said, hidden tang, probably a brass bolster. So that's enough of me talking. Let's get to work. All right, we're going to use the top of our file here because these jaws are hard. We're going to use them to help clean up these shoulders right here. All right, now that we've filed them flat, they're kind of square here. I'm going to come back in with this needle file. It's just a rounded, cheap little needle file. And we're going to make sure we have a radius in there to keep from any stress areas forming up, any stress risers from occurring. All right, as you can see here, we got some really deep file marks right here where when I filed these plunge lines in when I first made this knife, I actually cut it too far in on one side and then not enough on the other. I don't know if that'll focus or not. You kind of see it in that picture. So we're going to take this over to the grinder and we're going to try to flatten all of this out on both sides so we have a good flat surface to work with. Alright, this is where we currently are, a far cry from where we started at. Still got quite a bit of work to do, but it's getting there. I like the profile on this a whole lot better. And so next we need to move on to the bolster and pick out a handle material and get back to work. Alright, I found a nice piece of 3/8 inch scrap brass I've had laying around. We're going to go ahead and get this marked off and over to the bandsaw and get it cut out. And then mark it to the dimensions of our tang, and then drill it and use the files to go ahead and refine our slot and get it fitted up, and then we'll move on to working on the handle material. Now if you'll notice, I just kind of eyeballed this because I'm going to drill it undersized and then file it to the final shape. So as long as I get it in the right area, I should be pretty good. So now I'm going to pick out a drill bit that's slightly smaller than the size of our scribed area here, and then we'll get to marking it out and then get ready to drill it. Alright, to clean up this little bolster here we're making for our knife, I'm going to go ahead and jump in with some of these right here prior to using some little hand files. I got these off of Amazon. They were like $14. It comes with a whole set. The ones that are missing out of the set are laying over on my workbench. But they do a dang good job. If you don't have the money to get a milling machine, don't have access to a milling machine, these work great. They'll get you there, then you can start your hand filing. So these are, in my opinion, a must-have. Prior to having these, I had to do a lot of work with little files, and as you can tell, this is a very small space. It gets tedious trying to work it out just enough to get in there on the thinner tang knife. So that's enough of me blabbing. Let's go ahead and get the Dremel tool over here and get to cleaning this up. Alright, we got a nice fit up here on our guard. We're going to be using a piece of walnut for the handle for this. Same handle material I had on it when we first started out. Go ahead and get our placement for our tang marked out so we can go ahead and get it drilled up, and then we can trim this guard, dry fit everything, and then grind the finished bevels in, clean them up, and move on to assembly. Alright, we've got our walnut block here fitted up to the tang of our knife. We're going to go ahead and come in here and scribe this brass. Since this is going to be a kitchen knife, I'm not going to actually have a guard sticking out, so we're going to make it just a hair bigger than our ricasso area here going up. It'll just transition up and the handle will continue on from that point. So the next thing for us to do is head over to the bandsaw and scribe a line on this and get it cut off to the length we need, and then we can start figuring out how we want our handle to look. Alright, we got our handle ground pretty much to the shape that we want it. I'm going to move on now to transferring these angles that are on the handle over to the guard so we can grind the guard to shape. So let's get them scribed out and get to moving on. Alright, currently all of our pieces are figured out here. We've got our bolster figured out, we've got our handle ground the way it needs to be, cut to length. We're going to go over to the grinder. I'm going to grind in some nice new bevels on this, and then we'll move on to cleaning up our parts and get it glued all up. Alright, we got our blade etched up, we got our pieces all cleaned up. I'm going to go ahead and get this glued together, and I'll catch you at the end.
there's our finished project. Come a long way from where it started out. I appreciate you for joining us for today's episode. If you would, hit that like and subscribe button so you can see more of our content in the future. Remember to ring the bell for notifications when our newest content comes out. Like I said, I appreciate you for stopping by. Thank you, and we'll catch you on the next one. Bye-bye.